The Arizona sun, a relentless painter of vivid, almost brutal desert hues, cast long skeletal shadows across the meticulously landscaped grounds of Crimson Canyon Estates as the moving truck rumbled to a stop in front of the Bryants' new home. Detective Adam Bryant, a seasoned crime scene investigator whose professional life was an intimate, often grim study of chaos, and its indelible remnants felt a wave of something fragile yet insistent hope. This move to a sprawling Santa Fe-style house on Agave Lane, a street name that whispered of resilient desert life, was entirely for Noah. Their 7-year-old son, a boy with an imagination as vast and untamed as the desert sky, but a body cruelly betrayed by a rare aggressive autoimmune disorder, needed the dry air, the cleaner environment, and most importantly, a peaceful, predictable haven. Noah's condition required a daily, non-negotiable regimen of complex, life-sustaining medications delivered in precisely temperature-controlled packaging, a constant, tangible reminder of the delicate, precarious balance of his young life. Adam's wife, Dr. Sarah Bryant, a pediatrician whose days were spent mending and caring for other people's children with a fierce, gentle competence, carried the immense weight of Noah's fragility with a quiet strength that Adam deeply admired and relied upon. Their first few weeks in Crimson Canyon were a carefully orchestrated dance of settling in establishing Noah's new complex medical routines and cautiously exploring their immediate surroundings. The estate prided itself on its exclusivity, its pristine, almost unnaturally clean streets, and its comprehensive, if somewhat dauntingly voluminous list of homeowners association rules and regulations. Adam, whose job trained him to observe the minutiae of human behavior, the subtle tells and environmental cues that often betrayed hidden truths, noted the almost palpable undercurrents of a rigidly controlled, almost hermetically sealed environment. The lawns were unnervingly uniform emerald carpets defying the desert's natural inclinations. The native desert flora, while beautiful, was arranged with an almost architectural, inorganic precision. An unspoken code of quiet conformity, of adherence to an invisible but omnipresent standard, seemed to hang in the shimmering heat-laden air. The unofficial yet undisputed enforcer of this exacting code was Ms. Millicent Blackwood, a woman of indeterminate late middle age with a ramrod posture that seemed to defy gravity, a helmet of perfectly coiffed silver hair that remained impervious to the desert breeze, and eyes like chips of obsidian, cold, sharp, and missing nothing. Millicent resided in an imposing adobe mansion, a fortress of terracotta and silence strategically positioned at the entrance to their cul-de-sac. Her property was a monument to sterile perfection, its gravel paths raked into hypnotic Zen-like patterns that brooked no errant footprint, its cacti standing like stoic, unyielding sentinels guarding against any hint of disorder. Millicent was the long-standing, seemingly eternal chairwoman of the Crimson Canyon Architectural Review Board, the self-appointed head of the Neighborhood Watch, though what or whom she watched for seemed more aesthetic and behavioral than overtly criminal, and the most vocal, influential, and often feared member of the HOA board. Her nickname whispered with a mixture of trepidation and derision among the less compliant residents was the matriarch of malice, or more simply, HOA Karen. Before they even closed on the house, Sarah had done a drive-through of Crimson Canyon. She'd seen Millicent Blackwood in action. Once Millicent was observed meticulously measuring the length of a resident's decorative driveway flag, her lips moving as she consulted a small leather-bound notebook. Another time, Sarah witnessed Millicent intercepting a landscaper's truck, engaging in an animated one-sided discussion about the unauthorized decibel level of his leaf blower. A few days later, a neighbor, Mrs. Albright, a nervous woman with kind eyes, had quietly mentioned to Sarah during a chance encounter at the community mailbox that Millicent had a tragic past. Lost her younger sister Eleanor years ago, Mrs. Albright had whispered, her eyes darting around. Eleanor had a terrible chronic illness something that needed constant care. Millicent always felt the family didn't do enough, weren't orderly enough in their approach. She's been obsessed with control with perfection ever since, especially when it comes to anything she deems imperfect or a burden. Albright had also mentioned seeing Millicent in the HOA office late one evening, poring over what looked like technical manuals related to material degradation under extreme temperatures, muttering about substandard plastics. Sarah had filed these observations away, unsettling splinters in her otherwise optimistic outlook. The Bryants' first official interaction with Millicent Blackwood was not long in coming. It arrived not with a neighborly casserole, but in the form of a lavender-scented, impeccably typed letter delivered by Millicent herself, who appeared on their doorstep, looking as though she were conducting a surprise white glove inspection. The letter detailed, with excruciating, almost surgical precision, several areas of immediate concern, requiring your prompt remediation. These included the non-regulation hue and unapproved earthenware composition of the ceramic pot holding Sarah's beloved Meyer lemon tree on their portico. It was a cheerful cobalt blue, deemed jarringly incongruous with the approved desert earth tone palette as outlined in Appendix C Section 4, the unauthorized and aesthetically disruptive presence of Noah's small, brightly colored therapeutic swing set in their fully fenced backyard visible. Millicent noted with chilling specificity from the second-story window of my west-facing guest suite during the hours of 0900 and 1100, when the sun angle is optimal for such observation, and a small, almost invisible oil stain on their newly paved driveway, no larger than a silver dollar, but indicative of potential vehicular fluid leakage, a Class 2 environmental contaminant violation. As per Bylaw 7, subsection C, paragraph 2, necessitating immediate professional remediation and subsequent soil testing. Sarah, who had answered the door, read the letter with a growing sense of disbelief that quickly morphed into a quiet, simmering anger. "Ms. Blackwood?" She began, her voice carefully neutral, a tone she often used with overly anxious parents in her pediatric practice. "We're still settling in. The swing set is vital for Noah's physical therapy and sensory integration, and we ensured it wasn't directly visible from the street level. As for the oil spot, it must have been from the mover's truck. We'll clean it immediately, of course." Millicent Blackwood's lips, already a thin, bloodless line, seemed to compress further, as if physically restraining a torrent of disapproval. "Dr. Bryant, your professional title, while noted, does not grant you or your family immunity from the established standards and covenants of Crimson Canyon Estates." Vital is a subjective, often misused term. Aesthetic harmony and the preservation of our community's considerable property values are objective, quantifiable realities. The swing set, regardless of its alleged therapeutic purpose, is an eyesore, a brightly colored intrusion into the serene visual landscape. A formal petition for its immediate removal will be forthcoming from the Architectural Review Board, if it is not dismantled within 7 calendar days. Her gaze then flickered with something cold and appraising towards the interior of their home, as if scanning for further infractions, her eyes lingering for a moment on the neatly arranged row of Noah's medication cooler bags by the door. "And it is incumbent upon homeowners to ensure that all service vehicles accessing their property adhere to our stringent environmental protocols. The responsibility, and indeed the liability for the oil stain, therefore rests entirely with you." Adam, who had come to the door upon hearing Millicent's imperious carrying tones, stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Sarah. "Mrs. Blackwood." He said, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of unyielding steel that he usually reserved for uncooperative witnesses or belligerent suspects. "We will address the driveway spot and review the guidelines for the flower pot. However, Noah's swing set is not negotiable. It is a medical necessity prescribed by his specialists, and it is situated in our private, fully fenced backyard. We are well within our rights to provide for our child's medical and developmental needs on our own property." Millicent drew herself up to her full, formidable height, her posture radiating an unshakable conviction in her own absolute authority. "Rights, Detective Bryant," she stated, her voice dripping with condescension, "are often a matter of interpretation within a covenanted community such as ours. And I assure you my interpretation and that of the Architectural Review Board, which I chair, rarely errs. You will find that compliance, however reluctantly offered, is always the most prudent and ultimately the most peaceful course of action in Crimson Canyon." And with that she gave them a curt, dismissive nod that was more insult than acknowledgment turned on her heel, and marched away, her sensible orthopedic shoes making no sound on the pristine walkway. "Well," Adam said, letting out a slow, deliberate breath as Millicent's retreating figure disappeared behind her perfectly sculpted ocotillos. "She's even more charming and considerably more terrifying up close." Sarah leaned against the doorframe, her face etched with a worry that went beyond mere HOA squabbles. "This isn't just about rules, Adam. It's her. There's something malevolent, something deeply unwell about her." Malevolent was an apt, if understated, description. In the weeks that followed, Millicent Blackwood embarked on a systematic, insidious campaign of harassment directed at the Bryant family, her focus narrowing with chilling, almost obsessive precision on anything related to Noah and his complex medical needs. The weekly deliveries of Noah's medication, which arrived in specially marked insulated temperature-controlled containers from a national compounding pharmacy, became a particular point of contention. Millicent lodged formal notarized complaints with the HOA board about the excessive frequency of commercial and specialized vehicular deliveries to their address, citing concerns about increased traffic potential security risks to the community and the unsightly nature of such overtly medical paraphernalia. She once physically intercepted a delivery driver, a young man new to the route, subjecting him to a lengthy, intimidating interrogation about the contents of the suspicious refrigerated packages he was leaving at the Bryant's home, insinuating that they might contain illicit or experimental substances under the guise of medical supplies. The driver, thoroughly unnerved and confused, reported the incident to the pharmacy, causing a critical 24-hour delay in Noah's vital refill until Adam personally intervened with a furious, legally worded phone call to Millicent, warning her in no uncertain terms against interfering with federally protected medical deliveries and threatening legal action. Her response had been icily indifferent, delivered with a chilling lack of affect. "I am merely exercising due diligence as head of the Neighborhood Watch detective. Unusual activity, particularly involving unmarked refrigerated containers, warrants heightened scrutiny in these uncertain times," she complained to the HOA board in writing about the unpleasant, persistent medicinal and chemical odors she claimed sometimes emanated from their property. Noah required daily nebulizer treatments with a specific, pungent, compounded medication. She objected again formally to the visual clutter and potential biohazard of a small, discreetly placed locked Sharps disposal container located inside their own garage, which she somehow glimpsed when Adam was loading groceries into his car. Her intrusions became bolder, her pronouncements more outrageous, her sense of entitlement more absolute. She once suggested to Sarah during a tense community meeting, where Sarah had gone to plead for understanding regarding Noah's swing set, that perhaps the Bryants should consider a more specialized institutional living facility, one better equipped to handle chronic and complex pediatric health issues and their associated logistical burdens, thereby reducing the undeniable strain on community aesthetics resources and the general sense of well-being. The remark, delivered with a veneer of false saccharine concern, was met with a stunned, uncomfortable silence by the few other residents present. most of whom were too intimidated by Millicent's long-standing dominance and vindictive nature to challenge her openly. Sarah had been so shocked, so deeply hurt by the callousness of the suggestion that she could barely speak, tears stinging her eyes. Adam, upon hearing of it later that evening, had to physically restrain himself from marching over to Millicent's house and confronting her in terms that would have undoubtedly jeopardized his career and potentially landed him in jail. He tried instead to reason with the other HOA board members, painstakingly preparing and presenting them with a documented timeline of Millicent's targeted harassment, complete with copies of her letters, photographs, and even a statement from the intimidated delivery driver. But Millicent's influence was too deeply entrenched, her network of allies too solid. The board, largely composed of her longtime cronies, or those too fearful of her retribution to cross her, dismissed his concerns as unfortunate misunderstandings, an unavoidable personality clash, or, most insultingly, the oversensitivity of new residents unaccustomed to the rigorous standards of an elite community. "She's not just a busybody," Adam Sarah said one evening, her voice tight with a despair that mirrored his own, after another petty, infuriating citation from Millicent arrived this time regarding the unapproved wavelength and excessive lumen output of the low-voltage landscape lighting bulb in their front yard. "She's actively, deliberately trying to drive us out. She hates that Noah is sick. She sees him, his medicines, his swing, set everything about his life as an imperfection, a flaw in her perfect, sterile little world. It's like his illness is a personal affront to her sense of order." Adam knew Sarah was right. He had seen this kind of obsessive, controlling behavior before in his professional life. This pathological need to dominate and eradicate perceived imperfections, albeit usually in the context of more overtly criminal psychopathy. Millicent Blackwood was a domestic tyrant, wielding HOA bylaws. Like a finely honed weapon, her cruelty masked by a veneer of civic duty and a chillingly distorted sense of righteousness. He remembered Mrs. Albright's words about Millicent's sister Eleanor and her illness. Was Millicent replaying some past trauma, projecting her unresolved grief and anger onto Noah? The thought was deeply unsettling. The crisis point, the moment when Millicent's simmering malice boiled over into active catastrophic evil, arrived on a blisteringly hot Tuesday in late August, a day when the desert air itself felt like the breath of a furnace. Crimson Canyon Estates was undergoing a minor, but to Millicent monumentally important beautification project, the installation of new decorative stamped concrete curbing along several of the community pathways. The work was being done by a local reputable contractor, but Millicent Blackwood, as self-appointed chair of the beautification committee, had designated herself the de facto on-site supervisor, hovering over the workmen, critiquing their trowel work, measuring angles with a pocket laser, and ensuring every curve and contour met her exacting, almost fanatical standards. A section of fresh concrete had just been poured and meticulously smoothed along a pathway that ran near the Bryant's property line, bordering a small common garden area that Millicent was personally revitalizing with an obsessive, almost frantic energy. That same morning, Noah's monthly consignment of a particularly vital, custom-compounded immunosuppressant medication was due for delivery. This specific medication, a biologic, was crucial for preventing organ rejection following an earlier life-saving intestinal transplant procedure Noah had undergone as a toddler. It was incredibly expensive, difficult to synthesize, highly unstable, and had to be maintained at a precise, narrow temperature range 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. Any significant deviation in temperature, or any interruption in his dosage for more than a few hours, could trigger a cascade of irreversible, life-threatening complications. The pharmacy usually coordinated the delivery time precisely with Sarah or Adam to ensure immediate proper transfer to their specialized medical refrigerator. On this particular Tuesday, however, there was an unavoidable critical scheduling conflict. Sarah had a complex high-risk neonatal surgery at the hospital that could not be postponed, and Adam had been subpoenaed to provide expert testimony in a major felony trial. That morning, a case he had meticulously worked for over a year. They had, with considerable anxiety, arranged with the specialty pharmacy for the courier to leave the locked, insulated medication container in a pre-designated shaded and secure drop box on their porch. This drop box, more of a small reinforced steel cabinet, was bolted to the house wall and equipped with a high-security digital keypad lock Adam had installed himself, changing the manufacturer's default codes to a complex alphanumeric sequence known only to him and Sarah. It also had a small internal backup cooling unit good for about 6 hours if the main container's cold packs failed. The courier was instructed to text them both the moment the delivery was made, along with a photo of the container in the drop box, and Adam planned to race home during the court's anticipated lunch recess to retrieve it and transfer it to the medical fridge. It was a less than ideal arrangement born of absolute necessity, but one they had successfully, if nervously utilized, once before without incident. The courier, a reliable professional named Marcus, made the delivery at precisely 10:05 a.m., texting Adam and Sarah the confirmation photo and message as instructed. Adam, deeply engrossed in a tense, aggressive cross-examination by a defense attorney, saw the text notification flash briefly on his silenced smartwatch, but couldn't acknowledge it or leave the stand. Sarah was still scrubbed in her own phone, locked away. Millicent Blackwood, meticulously overseeing the concrete pour near the Bryants' property, her hawk-like eyes missing nothing, also saw Marcus, the delivery driver, arrive. She had made it her perverse business to observe, document, and internally critique every coming and going at the Bryant house, her suspicions and resentment festering like an untreated wound. She saw Marcus place the distinctive silver and blue insulated container into the porch drop box and securely close the heavy door. And in her warped, malevolent mind, already primed by weeks of escalating animosity and fueled by a lifetime of bitterness over her sister's illness and her own perceived helplessness, a monstrous, unthinkable idea began to take root. This medication, these constant, conspicuous deliveries, they were the symbol of everything she found offensive, disordered, and imperfect about the Bryant family. Their intrusion, their special needs, their constant visible burden on her pristine, meticulously controlled community. If the medication were to disappear, if Noah were to become less of a burden, perhaps then the Bryants would finally understand that Crimson Canyon was not the place for them. Perhaps it would cure them of their stubborn insistence on living where they were so clearly, in her eyes, unwelcome. Her thoughts a toxic, chilling brew of resentment, a desperate need for absolute control, and a terrifying detachment from consequence coalesced into a cold, deliberate plan. Waiting until the concrete crew took their mid-morning break, heading for the shade of a distant Ramada, and observing that the Bryant's street was momentarily blessedly deserted under the punishing sun, Millicent approached their porch. The drop box, while secure, was not, she had theorized, entirely impregnable to someone with sufficient determination and a certain devious ingenuity. In her obsessive, intrusive observations of the Bryants, she had on one occasion several weeks prior, from the vantage point of her second-story window, using a pair of powerful bird-watching binoculars, witnessed Adam accessing the drop box. She hadn't been able to see the exact sequence of the code he entered, but she had noted the rhythm of his fingers, the approximate number of digits, and crucially that he seemed to pause and look around before entering it, a subtle tell that perhaps it wasn't as random as one might hope. She had also, during a brief, neighborly visit to discuss landscaping compliance, surreptitiously taken a close-up photograph of the keypad model with her phone. A subsequent discreet online search for that specific high-security lock model had revealed its technical specifications, its resistance to brute force attacks, but also buried deep in a forum for locksmiths and security professionals, a passing mention of a rarely exploited firmware vulnerability in older units of that model, if a specific complex reset sequence was initiated physically on the keypad, followed by a very narrow window to input a temporary default override code. It was a long shot, something requiring precise timing and a bit of luck. But Millicent, in her twisted state, felt a perverse sense of destiny. Her heart thumping with a strange, illicit mixture of trepidation and vindictive, righteous excitement, Millicent, gloved hands working with surprising dexterity, attempted the complex reset sequence she had memorized. It failed twice. On the third painstaking attempt, a tiny green LED on the keypad blinked. Success. She quickly entered the temporary override. The heavy steel door of the Dropbox clicked open. She lifted the insulated container. It was cool to the touch, surprisingly heavy, radiating a sense of vital importance that only fueled her deranged resolve. She carried it quickly, furtively, her movements betraying none of her age, towards the section of freshly poured, still wet concrete near the common garden. No one was watching. The workmen were still out of sight. With a grim, almost orgasmic sense of satisfaction, she pushed the entire container deep into the wet, yielding concrete, using a discarded piece of rebar she'd spotted earlier to shove it down, until it was completely submerged, invisible beneath the viscous gray ooze. She then smoothed the surface over with a trowel she'd coolly appropriated from the work site, meticulously, almost lovingly erasing any obvious sign of disturbance. The medication, Noah's lifeline, his fragile hold on health, was now entombed in rapidly hardening stone. It would be gone, untraceable. A perfect, permanent, orderly solution in her distorted, grief-stricken, and malevolent view. Adam got home from court shortly after 1:00 p.m., the desert sun at its absolute zenith, the heat radiating from the pavement in shimmering, disorienting waves. His first urgent act was to go to the porch Dropbox. He punched in their complex alphanumeric code. Nothing! The lock remained stubbornly engaged. He tried again, slowly, deliberately. Still locked. A knot of ice, sharp and painful, formed in his stomach. This had never happened before. He fumbled for his master physical key, his hand suddenly slick with sweat, and opened the Dropbox. It was empty. Sarah, he called, his voice tight with a sudden, inexplicable, suffocating fear, even though he knew she wouldn't be home for hours. He checked his smartwatch. The courier's text and photo confirmed delivery at 10:05 a.m., 3 agonizing hours ago. Panic, cold and swift and absolute, gripped him. He raced inside, his heart hammering, searching fruitlessly, irrationally, hoping against hope that the courier had somehow misunderstood and left it inside the screen door despite the photo. Nothing. He called the specialty pharmacy. They confirmed the GPS coordinates of the delivery, the timestamp Marcus's positive verbal confirmation to their dispatcher upon completion. The medication had been delivered. It had been secured in the Dropbox. And now it was gone. This wasn't just a missing package of inconvenience. This was Noah's lifeblood. They had a small emergency reserve in the medical fridge, enough for perhaps 48 hours, if carefully, precisely managed. But replacing a full custom consignment, especially of this particular temperature. Sensitive biologic would take days, possibly weeks of frantic calls, new prescriptions, battles with insurance, and specialized expedited cryo shipping. Days Noah might not have. Days where his body could begin to reject the transplanted intestine that kept him alive. Adam's mind, the disciplined, analytical mind of a forensic investigator, began to click through possibilities, to build scenarios even as the raw, primal terror of a father threatened to overwhelm his professional composure. Theft. A random porch pirate sophisticated enough to bypass a high-security lock, highly unlikely in this supposedly secure gated community, patrolled by private security. And this was a clearly marked specialized medical container, not an easily pawned electronic device. It had no street value to a common thief. This was targeted. This was personal. His gaze, sweeping his surroundings with a new, desperate intensity, fell upon Millicent Blackwood's imposing house, then drifted to the nearby common area where the concrete crew had been working earlier that morning. He'd noticed them when he drove in the scent of wet cement still hanging in the hot air. Fresh concrete. A perfect, irreversible, untraceable place to dispose of something. Something one wanted to disappear forever. A horrifying suspicion born of Millicent's relentless, escalating animosity, her chilling pronouncements about Noah, her known presence in the area that morning, and Mrs. Albright's unsettling revelations about Millicent's past and her sister began to solidify into a sickening certainty. Could she be capable of something so monstrous, so depraved? He remembered her cold, obsidian eyes, her pronouncements about imperfection and burdens. Yes, he realized with a wave of nausea that threatened to buckle his knees. She was capable. She was more than capable. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his full CSI field kit from the trunk of his car, a comprehensive collection of specialized tools, chemicals, and documentation materials he sometimes brought home for off-duty consultation or personal projects that required meticulous precision. He walked with a dreadful leaden calmness he didn't feel towards the newly poured section of concrete pathway. It was still roped off with yellow caution tape, the surface beginning to cure to a dull, uniform gray under the blazing, unforgiving sun, looking deceptively benign. He knelt, his eyes trained by years of scrutinizing crime scenes for the faintest trace of evidence, scanning the surface, the edges, the surrounding disturbed soil. His training took over a shield against the crushing weight of his fear. He was looking for anything out of place, any subtle sign of recent disturbance beyond the normal expected work of the concrete crew. And then he saw it. Not one, but two tiny, almost invisible flecks of metallic blue, adhering to the still damp edge of the concrete, near a faint, almost obliterated scuff mark in the adjacent gravel that looked suspiciously like the distinctive tread pattern of a specific brand of high-end orthopedic gardening shoe, the kind Millicent invariably wore. The blue flecks. He recognized the shade instantly. It was the exact proprietary PMS color of the specialized pharmacy's logo, a tiny corner of which was printed on their insulated medication containers. Circumstantial, yes. A defense attorney would try to tear it apart. But his gut and instinct, honed by thousands of hours spent reading the silent, damning language of crime scenes, screamed at him with irrefutable certainty. He needed to act fast. The concrete was setting with every passing minute, the Arizona sun baking it hard. He called his captain, his voice low and urgent, laying out the situation in clipped professional tones, the missing life-sustaining medication, the critical timeline for Noah. His horrifying suspicion, the blue flecks. He requested immediate priority assistance, a public works crew with concrete cutting tools, a forensic team for support, and an immediate emergency search warrant for Millicent Blackwood's property and person, just in case the medication wasn't in the concrete. His captain, knowing Adam's impeccable record, his lack of hysteria even under extreme pressure, and the sheer gravity of the accusation, promised to expedite everything, cutting through red tape with the urgency the situation demanded. But time was of the essence for the medication itself for Noah. While waiting for official backup, Adam made a decision. He couldn't wait. He had to try to locate it himself now before it was too late, before the concrete became an utterly impenetrable tomb, before Noah's window of safety closed. He began a systematic, non-destructive examination of the surface of the newly poured section, using a small, high-intensity variable spectrum flashlight from his kit to look for minute variations in texture, slight depressions, or subtle discolorations that might indicate a submerged object. He gently, meticulously probed the surface in the area near the blue flecks with a thin, calibrated steel rod, feeling for changes in density. About 6 feet along the new pathway, His rod met a subtle, almost imperceptible resistance, a few inches below the surface, something that felt less dense than compacted aggregate, more yielding, more hollow. The area of resistance was roughly the size and shape of Noah's medication container. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the scorching afternoon. He had to be sure, and he had to be incredibly careful. Destroying the evidence, or God forbid the medication itself, if it was, indeed, there was not an option. The public works crew and a detective colleague Adam trusted implicitly. Detective Maria Ramirez arrived with astonishing speed, sirens respectfully silenced, as they neared the scene, along with 2 uniformed officers to secure the perimeter. Adam quickly, concisely briefed. Ramirez showed her the blue flecks, the subtle depression, his chilling reasoning. Ramirez, a sharp, experienced investigator who had worked with Adam on numerous complex cases, trusted his renowned instincts without question. Recognizing the exigent life-or-death circumstances, she authorized the immediate careful excavation of that specific section of concrete. The next hour was a masterclass in controlled urgency, a desperate race against time and temperature played out under the relentless Arizona sun. Adam, his face a grim mask of concentration, his movements precise and economical, despite the tremor in his hands that he fought to control, directed the public works crew. They couldn't use heavy jackhammers or powerful drills. The vibrations could damage the container or its precious, fragile contents. Instead, using small, diamond-tipped masonry saws, specialized concrete chisels, and painstaking, agonizing care, they began to chip and cut away at the still pliable but rapidly hardening concrete around the suspected area. Adam, on his hands and knees, meticulously brushed away debris with a soft, forensic brush, photographing every layer, every step, preserving the chain of custody, as if this were any other major crime scene, which he knew with a cold, sickening certainty that settled deep in his bones it was. And then they found it. Encased in a thick, unforgiving layer of gray concrete like a modern-day fossil was the unmistakable high-tech silver and blue form of the insulated medication container. Its distinctive pharmacy logo, though coated in a thick layer of cement dust, was just visible. A collective horrified gasp went up from the small group assembled. Detective Ramirez looked at Adam, her expression a mixture of profound shock, disbelief, and a dawning reluctant admiration for his terrible, accurate intuition. Madre de Dios. Adam Ramirez breathed, her voice barely a whisper. You were right. That woman. The container was carefully, almost reverently extracted from its concrete tomb. The surrounding cement had already begun to leach the cold from it. The internal temperature, Adam knew, was undoubtedly compromised, potentially critically. But the medication itself, the life-saving biologics, hopefully were still sealed within their primary glass vials inside the container's insulated walls. It would be a race against time to get it to the pharmacy for immediate analysis, to see if any of it was salvageable, and to arrange an emergency off-protocol replacement for Noah. While Adam supervised the careful, meticulous packaging of the concrete-encased container as critical biosensitive evidence, Detective Ramirez and the 2 uniformed officers headed directly with grim determination for Millicent Blackwood's imposing adobe mansion. Millicent answered the door, a half-eaten cucumber sandwich on a delicate china plate in her hand. Her expression one of carefully cultivated, indignant surprise. Though Adam, had he been there, would have noted the almost imperceptible flicker of something akin to panic in her cold, obsidian eyes. Detectives, to what do I owe this rather dramatic and unwelcome intrusion? I was just about to take my afternoon tea and prepare for my Architectural Review Board subcommittee meeting. Miss Millicent Blackwood, Detective Ramirez said, her voice devoid of any warmth, her own eyes hard as polished steel. We have some questions for you regarding a serious felony committed this morning. We have reason to believe you are directly involved in the theft and malicious, potentially lethal destruction of life-sustaining medication belonging to a 7-year-old minor child, Noah Bryant. We have recovered the medication, Ms. Blackwood, from the fresh concrete you were so diligently supervising this morning on Agave Lane. Millicent's carefully constructed composure, usually so unshakable, so impervious, visibly cracked. Her face paled to a ghastly mottled white, then flushed a blotchy, furious red. That is an outrageous, preposterous accusation. I know nothing about any medication. This is harassment, slander. That Bryant boy is a constant source of trouble and expense to this community, and his parents are negligent and— Save it, Ms. Blackwood Ramirez cut her off, her voice, sharp as shattered glass. You are under arrest for felony theft, reckless endangerment of a child, and attempted murder. You have the right to remain silent. Her arrest in full view of several stunned neighbors who had been drawn by the commotion, and the sight of multiple police vehicles converging on Millicent's fortress, was a moment of shocking, almost theatrical downfall. The undisputed queen of Crimson Canyon, the unassailable enforcer of rules and arbiter of taste, was being led away in handcuffs. Her indignant protests, her threats of lawsuits, her desperate self-serving justifications dissolving into a panicked, incoherent babble as the steel cuffs closed around her surprisingly frail wrists. The subsequent investigation and trial laid bare the chilling depth of Millicent Blackwood's cruelty, her pathological need for control, and the tragically distorted grief that had festered into a monstrous obsession. Her meticulously kept gardening journal, seized under warrant, contained veiled, increasingly resentful references to the Bryants, to the sickly child, and to the unacceptable burden of imperfection. It also contained disturbing handwritten notes about her late sister Eleanor's final agonizing months, interspersed with angry diatribes about the failure of medicine and the ugliness of disease. Several neighbors, now feeling safe to speak out from under the shadow of her long reign of intimidation, came forward with their own unsettling stories of Millicent's past, bullying her vindictive actions and her disturbing fixation on purity and order. The physical evidence was irrefutable. The blue flecks of paint from the container found at the concrete site, the distinctive scuff mark matching her orthopedic gardening shoes, the recovered medication container itself bearing her faint but identifiable fingerprints on its outer shell despite the abrasive concrete. Her weak, almost laughable defense, a desperate claim that she had merely found the container discarded as litter near the worksite, and in a moment of misguided civic duty had tidied it away by burying it in the wet concrete, believing it to be harmless rubbish, was systematically dismantled by the prosecution and met with derision by the jury. The pharmacy, working against the clock, miraculously managed to salvage a small but viable portion of Noah's medication from the least compromised vials within the recovered container, enough with careful dose adjustments to see him through the critical period until an emergency replacement consignment could be synthesized, rigorously tested, and rushed to them. The stress of the ordeal, the terrifying hours of uncertainty, and the unavoidable fluctuations in his medication levels took a significant toll on Noah's fragile health, necessitating a brief hospitalization. But he was, as always, resilient. His spirit, like his father's unwavering determination, and his mother's fierce love, proved stronger than Millicent's malice. Millicent Blackwood was found guilty on all charges, including attempted murder, the jury clearly recognizing the lethal potential of her actions. At her sentencing, the judge, visibly moved by Adam's and Sarah's victim impact statements detailing Noah's ordeal and his lifelong battle, delivered a scathing denunciation. Mrs. Blackwood. The judge intoned, his voice resonating with cold fury. Your actions were not merely criminal. They were a shocking betrayal of common humanity, a calculated sadistic act of cruelty that defies comprehension. You weaponized your position of trust and your distorted grief to inflict unimaginable suffering upon an innocent child and his family. You are a danger to society, a chilling example of how obsession and a thirst for absolute control can curdle the human heart into something monstrous. He sentenced her to the maximum term allowed by law, ensuring she would spend the remainder of her days in state prison. Her imposing adobe mansion, her meticulously crafted symbol of power and sterile prestige, was eventually sold to help satisfy the substantial civil judgment awarded to the Bryants for Noah's medical expenses, his pain and suffering, and their considerable ongoing emotional distress. The Bryants, though deeply scarred emotionally and psychologically by their horrific experience in Crimson Canyon Estates, made the difficult decision to stay. They refused to be driven out by one woman's hatred, refused to let her poison their hope for Noah's future in the place they had chosen for his health. With Millicent gone, a palpable sense of relief, of a suffocating weight lifted spread through the community. The HOA board was completely overhauled, its voluminous punitive rulebook drastically simplified, its focus shifted from pedantic enforcement to genuine community-building inclusivity and mutual support. Several neighbors, led by a now more vocal Mrs. Albright, organized a Noah's Garden of Hope initiative, transforming the common area near the infamous concrete path, which was entirely dug up and replaced with a vibrant, accessible sensory garden, into a symbol of resilience and renewal. Adam continued his work as a crime scene investigator, his forensic skills having not only solved a complex and deeply personal crime, but far more importantly, having saved his own son's life. He became a quiet but determined advocate for families navigating the complexities of pediatric chronic illness. Sarah, with renewed purpose and a deeper understanding of the invisible battles many families face, channeled her experiences into her pediatric practice, becoming an even more compassionate and fierce champion for her young patients. And Noah, brave, resilient. Noah continued to thrive, his laughter once again echoing in their home on Agave Lane, his therapeutic swing set now a joyful, unapologetic fixture in their backyard. The Arizona sun still beat down on Crimson Canyon, but for the Bryants and for many of their neighbors, it now illuminated a landscape of hard-won hope. A community slowly, painfully healing a future where the only rules that truly mattered were those of kindness, compassion, and the unwavering, ferocious protection of the innocent.